Welcome to this session, Sustainable Value Chains and Plastics. I hope everybody find the room here. I see someone looking around. Maybe we just wait for you to sit down. Yes, I'm very pleased that I have the possibility to chair this session with my colleague Sanjeeva Barjai, and my name is Katrin Greif. In this session, we just had a change. We have two slots here. The first slot is focusing on sustainable value chains, and we don't have 3 presentations here. We just have 2 presentations, so we have a bit more time. But still, we have to look at the time because we are late now, so we already used it. So the first presentation will be from Fernando Coelho. I hope I pronounced it right. He's from the Joint Research Center from the European Commission, and he will tell us something about the raw materials information system. And the second speaker will be Kirsten Remmen, and she's from EMPA here in Switzerland, and she's a research associate there. And she will tell us something about recoverability and availability of raw materials and secondary raw materials. And just to your information, we have 8 minutes for every presentation. And after the presentation, we have 2 minutes to clarify aspects, to clarify some specific questions. And we will discuss both presentation afterwards when the presentations are finished. And after that, I also wanted to welcome you to come up here. But now I'm looking forward to your presentation, Fernando. So please just come up here, and I think you can use the microphone or also that microphone. And here is
from here I cannot see the presentation, so
the pointer and
okay.
Yes, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. So my name is Fernando Coelho. I work in the GRC, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. I will tell you something personal. I was born in Brazil, in a place called Minas Gerais, that is like literally mean the mining place. So since my childhood, I was involved with, not involved, but feeling the impact of the mining activities, and also like the negative impacts as well. If you remember this collapse of the dam, the tailing that collapsed a couple of years ago, I grew up like 200 meters of that river. So I have also like a personal involvement with the raw materials. So my scientific background, just a bit to introduce myself, I did a PhD on the recycling of magnets, critical raw materials. I work as a postdoc in the TU Delft in the Netherlands, where I work also with recycling of e-waste. And then I joined the commission in the GRC. The GRC is the Joint Research Center. So today, my talk will be about this. I will showcase this project that we have, that is the Raw Materials Information System. I work in the GRC, that is the scientific body of the Commission. The Commission is divided in around 33 departments, let's call it like that. And there's one department that's a scientific department. We have around like 3,000 scientists in all the fields that we try to provide and also translate scientific knowledge for the policymaker, but also for the society. So we are very proud to be independent and science-based, I have to say. We do collaboration across several institutions. We do, I would say, multilateral interactions with different stakeholders, and we try to provide knowledge for not only for the policymakers, but for the society, for a healthier and a sustainable and more secure society. So in the same way that the GRC is compiling information from different sources and trying to translate and digest it, the raw materials information system is also looking to do the same. Oops, disappear. I apologize. Yeah, so the raw materials information system, we deal mostly with metals and minerals. It's working automatically. So these are different topics that you can see there. I don't know how to pause it. I had an idea here. I will invite you all to open your phone because we really like to use phones. And if you put in the Google RMIS and raw materials, very quickly, you can see our website. It was not supposed to be automatic, but let's see if, yeah. And then in the second box, you have raw materials profile. If you click there, very quickly, don't open your WhatsApp, please. And then you have one of the box that we have in our oh my God, I don't know how to stop it. It was not in my presentation. If someone is controlling it, can you put it to don't be automatic, please? Meanwhile, you can scroll the RMIS website and see different kind of informations we have there. We recently relaunched the website, and we have like more user-friendly layout. Yeah. Okay, good. Seems to be good now. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Then you could go back. More. Okay. These are different topics that we have in the RMIS. So we find like from governance, from circular economy, and several other topics. Next, please. I'm not able to change from here. So this is one example of one of the raw materials profile. We have more than 99 raw materials there, and we have information about supply, about the primary production, and several indicators related to materials. We have critical, non-critical materials. It was like last two weeks ago, we had a new model of production of each one of these materials where we compile different source and of data to put there. Next, please. So another important box that we have there are the country profiles, where we compile information and indicators in the 27 EU countries and plus 50 African countries. We are now expanding it for the Latin America and Caribbean countries to have like a kind of compilation of different indicators related to production, related with also economic and social and environmental indicators. Next, please. So another thing that we do is bring emerging response to emergent topics like trade-related topics, trade restrictions, conflicts. So we quickly set up different dossiers. Like now, we are preparing one about the semiconductors because of some Chinese restrictions. Next, please. And we also analyze different, what we call the strategic sectors of the European Commission, but global in general. Next, please. So this is one of the new websites, the new information that we have there in our website, where we have different 5 sectors and 15 technologies across the 5 sectors, where we analyze supply, demand, also mitigation actions that has to be done and that are possible parts of the solution for each one of those. So in the RMIS, you're going to find it like in a nutshell, but if you go in the report, you have like more detailed information about each one of those. Next, please. And another important part of our project, this project, is the collaboration with different institutions, different projects. Like this is one example of a partnership we have with the ProSun project that was the predecessor of the Futuram that Christian will talk about in the next presentation. So we kind of get, let's say, the excellent projects and try to keep the results and exploit the results and make good use of that. So this one example was this battery app that's a kind of urban mining tool for not only for the battery but also for the end-of-life vehicles, and we expect to have more with the Futuran project in the future. So next slide, please. Yeah, and this is the last slide. I apologize for the technicalities, and we are very open for collaboration with European projects, with different projects. Our mission is to compile and to provide information and raw materials in different spheres, like social, life cycle assessment, economic aspects as well, trade related, and to have a kind of platform and vitrine of the Commission, because there are so many sources of information that we need somehow a place where we can try to harmonize the information and to find it in a compiled way. So next one. Thank you very much. I will invite you all to subscribe to our newsletter and to explore our website and drop us an email whenever you want. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the technical problems. I hope we solved it now and don't have any other problems for the next presentations. But are there any questions for clarification? Just right now? Okay, I don't see that, so we can discuss after the next presentation. And now I welcome Kirsten Remmen, and as I told you before, she will tell us something about recoverability and availability and about a framework they developed in the project you just also told us about. So yes, just come here and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks a lot. I will try my luck now with the, let's see. Yeah, my name is Kirsten. I work for Empower. I joined Empower 1 year ago. And I've been mainly working on the FutureM project. And the FutureM project, you already saw the booth downstairs probably. It's about the future availability and recoverability of secondary raw material. Here today I will talk about the framework, and to start with that, I would like to tell you what the project is about to give you an understanding what we'll be doing there. So, oh, that also didn't look like that when I sent it. So I'm really sorry for that. So on this really nice picture, so at our last consortium meeting in Berlin, we had artists there to capture our ideas and our vision in a nice visual manner. And it's supposed to be the full picture. And as you can see here in the middle, there's like people getting like like electronic waste and taking them apart. And we are looking at the data. So you look at the tool open data, and then you see on the right people making better decisions, impacting less dependency on imports and also on the society. I also put some like writing to it. So we want to have the knowledge on the availability and recoverability of secondary raw materials within the EU. I have to point that out. We are only looking at Europe at the European or EU level. We specialize on critical raw materials, and we are doing scenarios from now also to 2050. So that's also one of our approaches. We want to disseminate this via the secondary raw material knowledge base. So this will be one of our main outputs, products, and we want to enable fact-based decision-making on science-based targets. So I think that is something that we really want to achieve with our project, and to really understand how we can enable those data to really make our decisions on the science. And we are looking only at 6 waste streams, so not everything. And you can here see the small icons. So we have waste electronic, so EEE. We have end-of-life vehicles. We have batteries. We have slags and ashes. But we also have mining waste and CDW, which is construction and demolition waste. Okay. So when we started our project, we realized that we first need to define our terminology, our definitions, to have a common language, because otherwise it's very difficult to communicate, not just the data or the softwares in between each other, but also human beings, because we come from different sectors. We are a multidisciplinary project, and therefore we have to define our common language and also to align with existing stuff, because the stuff that's out there is really good. And so we have to use it and leverage on it. So we started with EU binding policies. Therefore, examples, I will give a few examples. We used waste. We used it from the Waste Framework Directive, which makes sense as we are European projects, so we have to align with it. Other standards, for example, recoverability, there we look at existing standards and use the definitions in there to make sure that our framework is aligned and compatible with the other stuff. Other frameworks, for example, like the CIA Central Framework, but also the UNFC framework, we've tried to align there and use terminology and definitions which have been defined as part of these frameworks in our FutureM framework. Previous project, the ProSim project was mentioned. So what has been defined there, for example, product keys, how to identify certain products or how to assign certain like elements to products and stuff like that we use from the ProSim project. Also, of course, statistics, waste statistics here, we use the European waste codes to be aligned. But also we're looking into new concepts and trying to define them and to understand what is needed to define these concepts, or to further develop them, and recoverability, not just looking at mass-based indicators, but what's further needed to really understand the recoverability of elements or products or materials. So FutureM is all including this, and of course we're having further puzzle pieces to add and to make sure that the FutureM framework is another puzzle piece in the big picture solving this topic. So what are the models, or what are the several steps we're looking at in FutureM? We have the put on market, which of course our 4 product-centric waste streams will be, it's important with batteries, end-of-life vehicles, EEE, construction, demolition. Then we have to see how are these waste streams collected? So how is the collection system? And we have to understand this, and that's it's different, of course, in every country, depending on the product and so forth and so on. So already there we have major differences we have to research. Then we have recovery. And there we come, of course, different technologies, depending on the collection, different technologies can be applied. And therefore, we're looking into that step as well. And they're going beyond prosom, because in prosom, they stopped at put on market collection. And in future, we go the next step, really looking into recovery and understanding that part. And then for the mining waste, of course, we don't have a put on market. We rather have a stock that we have to analyze. So that's, again, a different model, a different approach we have to follow. Also different data availability. We also have to consider that. There, of course, we have to go into the recovery technologies. And the same for the slags and ashes. Again, stock is completely different compared to the put on market approach that we choose for the other 4 ones. But again, we have the recovery, and all of them are combined in one step, which is incineration or metallurgical processes or other production processes. So that's where they meet. And that's also like a crucial step to understand how these products end up there. And then we defined these, flows coming out of those recovery steps as secondary raw material, because it can be those regs, it can be taken instead of primary raw materials. So we defined this as secondary raw material, the green arrows you see here. And last but not least, then we have the recoverability of elements, material components, and products. And I want to show you an example why it's so important to have all these different levels, because it's not just looking at the CRM, it's a critical raw material. It doesn't give you any knowledge. If I say, yes, there is so much scandium or aluminium available, I need to know in which form, in which material, in which product this is available to really understand if it's recoverable or not, because it doesn't help me if I just say, yeah, I know it's there, but I don't know in which form and what technology is available. So we really want to do that step and identify the sweet spots, then to later help to make decisions based on this. The example is aluminium in vehicles. So it's put on the market. Aluminium is in vehicles. We know that it's a critical raw material, various alloys in multiple vehicles for multiple compounds. Then we have alloys also containing other elements, which some of them are CRMs again. 1 minute left, okay. And then we have several collection and recovery technologies, as well as high dependency and product of end of life, as well as further dependencies, as for example, import and location of product type. That leads us to the solution that are that we understand the conclusion that we really have to understand the data needs. And how do we enable this framework? We have the needed data, and there we have various attributes on several granularity levels from all life cycle steps and from multiple sources. Then when we go, that's a challenge to really not, it's openly accessible. I think that's one of our key messages also in future. This data needs to be openly accessible and to be interoperable and possible to speak to each other. Not harmonized data, scattered and not holistic. I think that's also the challenge. And our solution is here building an interoperable model, as well as allowing to infer the knowledge, or that the model infers knowledge from existing data here. So the next step is building trust in the future model. I think that's also important, that we make sure what are the uncertainties and stakeholders. Then we have to enable the interoperability. We follow an open data approach, as I mentioned earlier. We are adding additional concepts, for example, ontologies, discuss data governance. And last but not least, look at the recoverability, as I mentioned earlier, and really understanding the data needs to define and enable this concept. And with this, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and also put your attention to our workshop, Enabling Secondary Raw Material Management by Data Governance, which will be done by Susanne Rotter and me on Wednesday morning. So I'm looking forward to that, to discuss with you with a little bit more time, maybe. That would be great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I would like to welcome you both up here, so we can just start the discussion. Yes, you can also sit down and take also a microphone. So, are there any questions to both of our presenters? Please, perhaps you just say your name and yes, please.
I can do it for
you have the microphone in front of you, so you can just use it.
Okay, if you want me to. Richard Berner from Adelphi Research. We are a Berlin-based think tank. I was just wondering because you were telling about the Futurum framework, but I didn't really understand. It's more of a learning question. What is the main target group? Is it policymakers who use this data and then drive policies from that, or?
Yeah, that's definitely one target group. Policymakers really to provide science-based decision or fact-based decision making. That's one group, but also, for example, for recyclers to understand where to invest, for example, or where it really makes sense to look into. So that's another target group. Yes, definitely.
Behind there is a question. Please use the microphone because we have also online members here.
Is that okay? Yeah, hi, Peter Hopkinson from University of Exeter in the UK. We've been doing a lot of work very similar to both of you. Can you say a little bit how have you attempted to link industry data to public data? And that's the first question. And what do you do when the coding systems in the statistics don't give you any direct visibility of critical raw materials? So, for example, if you wanted to track and trace a rare earth permanent magnet through the European economy, how would you do it using your models?
It's for me.
That's for both of you, yeah.
Who can start?
Yeah, of course. Like nowadays with the statistical data, you cannot track it. I mean, that's one of the really difficulties that we are seeing, and where we definitely think it would be important to have this data, because the databases exist where you have all this knowledge about the products, that this industry data is made accessible. For example, there's initiatives now like the DPP and things like that. And we need to use this data as well. And I think that is one really important point to address this. And then we try to fit our models, because in the last years, there's been a lot of data generated to fit our models to build trust by also like naming the uncertainties that they are. I think that is very important, and to make sure. And if we have, if we do a batch test or analyze one car in one country, we have to make sure it's been visible that it's only that situation, and it cannot be made the same situation for the whole of Europe. So we're trying to look at the databases that are there. We want to make it visible. We want to use novel not novel, but we want to use concept like ontologies, for example, to go into that direction. And of course, in the end, want to help also with our framework to make people aware that currently with the statistic we have, we cannot track it. We cannot fulfill what was asked in the CRM Act. So that is also one of the things we like envisioning. Maybe at the end we will see it's possible, but that's what we envision as well. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, in our case, we use data that are available to different data source. Sometimes it's based on our analysis. We use also like reports from a different industry, let's say reports from McKinsey, and we compile the data, what is available. We do internal analysis, and when we believe that it's concise data, we would make it available. Basically, like in the case of the magnets, I guess it's not available. So what is available, we have like public.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Maybe a comment from me. So we work, I represent a company who uses the databases for compliance with the European regulations. And I have to say that databases are very poor and they're very bad. And we cannot use them because they work with averages, and the European legislation requires verification, validation, and traceability, pure traceability, real-time traceability. And current databases are not fulfilling this in any way. So the request to you, maybe speed up, maybe work on the real-time data collection and verification. So this will be definitely very helpful to us to fulfill all the European legislation requirements. So if possible, please.
Yeah, but maybe to comment on that, I mean, we are the scientists, right? So I'm not sure if we can fill the databases. So I think that's a little bit the question, right? So who is responsible, or like, that's what we're going to discuss in our workshop, the data governance. Okay, who is responsible for providing the data? So that's an important topic, an important issue. So the data is somewhere and it needs to be aligned, it needs to be harmonized. And who is responsible for it? Who are the stakeholders in that? And that's a so looking forward to discuss this on Wednesday with you.
Maybe one question further on this topic: how can a digital product passports help? So to you. Question.
Do you want to answer the question? You
do
seem
you
very keen on raising your hand.
But no, do you think it can help?
Yes, definitely. I mean, it depends a lot what kind of data is being put in there. And then again, if this part of data is made publicly available, I think that is also the key. The data is there. It needs to be publicly available. It needs to be used. It needs to be transparent and harmonized. And I think those are because everybody's saying it all the time, but I think those are the hurdles are what's hindering us to really leverage this knowledge, because when you look at standards are differently have a different system than end of life, for example. So in that, if we understand the connection there and make sure that we use the same system, and I think then we can definitely go a step further. I'm not saying that we solve this topic completely, but we can move further. Yes.
Yes, and I just want to add that a lot of information is already there, but it's complex, like the database for OEMs, like when they produce a car, it's private, but we know that maybe it's kind of passport, the material passport is already embedded there, but there's no access, public access to it. So it's a complex issue, and the regulations trying to step in, but then it's let's say a kind of fight. And yeah, we try to solve it somehow.
And still we need frameworks, so it's still a work for us scientists to work on. And one question to you, Fernando. There's also an UN classification framework for raw materials. Do you integrate that in the raw materials information system?
Well, not specifically. We don't have we use the criticality assessment, and I'm not sure if it's in the criticality assessment of raw materials there is like a standardization on that. But that's what in the case of the raw materials profile, we get indicators from the European database and we publish there.
Okay,
You're talking about the UNFC framework?
Yes.
Yeah. As I mentioned, we have a work package just focusing on that, and we will include that, and it's included in the Future project, and we try to understand also how we can use that data and that knowledge for that. So we are, we are aiming at that. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Very good. Are there any more questions from the audience? Maybe from the participants online? No? Okay, I have one last question, because you just told us you also wanted to integrate sustainability indicators and also circularity indicators. What kind of indicators do you want to integrate?
Well, we are looking at recoverability, and we want to understand how the recoverability, this concept needs to be redefined to understand really, if not just mass-based, but rather going into the direction of like the recoverability of aluminium. What grade is it? Is it downcycling? Is it functional recycling? Rather going into the direction, that direction, not really developing indicators, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
I want to add that, like, also to measure circularity, it's under discussion. Like, at least from my knowledge, we have some indicators to end of life input rates and so on, but I think we are building like the scientific community is building also like the better indicators to measure circularity.
Yes, thank you very much, you both. So now we're coming to the second slot for the session of today, and I will pass on to my colleague. So.
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this session, slot 2. We have 4 speakers in slot 2. So my request to the speakers will be to be very efficient and not give me a heart attack. But we are running out of time. Without any further ado, let me invite Janak De Silva from IUCN Switzerland to make his presentation on linking mismanagement plastic waste flows to critical ecosystems in the Western Indian Ocean. All yours.
Thank you very much. I hope I can master this slide presentation. Oops. Yep. Well, thank you very much for offering me the opportunity. I'm going to take a slightly different step because we're going into nature and the relationship to plastics. And IUCN, for those of you who may not be aware, is actually one of the oldest conservation organizations. We are a membership of over 1,400 members, both government and civil society. And we also have approximately 15,000 scientists as part of our commission. So our colleague here, Alexandra, is part of our Commission for Environmental Law, who you'll hear from later on. This piece of work is really a mixture of materials that we've collected, and it really responds to what's being discussed for many of you. What you might realize is the global plastics treaty negotiations that are currently underway. And it was quite interesting listening to you before because I can see so many parallels on harmonizations, on data governance. Those are all of the very same issues we're struggling with. So I think there's a lot of compatibility and learning that I think we can bring from what you're doing and what you've been advancing over the last few years. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about the challenges of plastics because that is really a hot button topic globally at the moment. And as I mentioned, currently, we are on a very fast track for a global negotiation for a new treaty. And it's very ambitious, aiming to be done in 2 years, which is unheard of for any kind of global multilateral environmental agreement. But what I wanted to highlight very quickly, and this is some information from the OECD, is that I think there is a general recognition that plastics as a product is vital to our society and the way we live. But its growth and its magnitude is having a significant impact both on our environment and where it ends up. And so addressing it has been really a priority. And a lot of that has focused on the big picture, understanding the material flow, where it is going, what's happening, how can you recover it, the amount of recycling that currently takes place. But one element that probably hasn't received as much interest is the impacts on biodiversity. And when we look at plastics, really what you can see is it's an integrated approach that expands right across the environment, from the ocean right down to the mountains. And that pathway that it follows through its use and where it ends up is very complex. So there's no one simple solution here, much as we would like to think of it. And so understanding and quantifying all of those elements is really quite essential to even make some basic decisions. And I think identifying essentially national level quantification of how much it is, what type of material it is, where is it going, we're in our infancy. And understanding that information has been quite a challenge. And the impact of that has been quite significant. You see it in the waste dumps or the waste sectors in many parts of the world where the informal waste sector actually earn a living out of this. And this goes into some of the issues of just transition. How do we move people from jobs and work that really is not demeaning, as we've discussed and heard very eloquently earlier today? The impacts on biodiversity are equally important. And most of you probably have seen that in relation to those fish and whales with stomachs. But really, if you want to make decisions, you've got to do something a little bit more quantitative. And so this was really an attempt to try and put different pieces of knowledge and information together. And the two main pieces we've used here is one is with UNEP. IUCN has developed what we call the UNEP IUCN hotspot guidance. And it's essentially a method to quantify plastic waste flows through a national economy and identify how it comes in from its imports, where it flows, and where it ends up. And so that gives us actually quite important or useful spatial information. And what we figured is we also have a lot of biological assessment tools, such as the STAR, which is the Species Threat Abasement and Recovery process. And that is a tool that is designed for businesses to make decisions on the kinds of places that they might want to focus on in terms of the impacts they might see on biodiversity. So our goal was really in this first stint to put all of these different pieces of information together and see what comes up. So it's really very much an exploratory analysis. And what we have here is, I'm going to show you two slides or a couple of slides that focus one on the relationship of the flow or the leakage of what we call plastic into the environment, which you see in this example from Mozambique, which is where we've been working in one of the countries, to try and map that to what we see as critical ecosystems. So the graphic on the left actually shows essentially a normalized view of plastic leakage into the environment. The figures on the left and in the middle and right really try to overlay that on what we see are quite important. For example, in this case, from the STAR assessment, the areas in Mozambique that are seen as threats to biology and ecological systems. So these are areas where it has been identified through things like the IUCN Red List as being critical. So overlaying all of that, particularly in relation to things like key biodiversity areas, and those are what we call hotspots for biodiversity. If we overlay all of that, can we see patterns and trends that might be relevant to target our attention? Because this is a problem that's so large that we really need to focus that attention. The initial results are quite, what I would say, needs a bit more work. And it's exploratory. And I think in the macro sense of when you try to look at those relationships at a national level, as you can see from some of the correlation assessments that we've done in relation to the threat assessment score, which is a metric to capture threat relation to plastic leakage, we see actually weak relationships. But that doesn't tell us the whole story. The story is really a little bit more complicated. So when you overlay some of this information, and you see it in the figure on the right here, what you will actually see is that as you would expect, quite often the leakage of plastic surrounds urban areas. It's not in areas of where there's key biodiversity. Those areas are generally these things. But what it does overlay quite closely is areas where there are threats to species, and those are outside what we would call traditionally protected areas. Now, these are some first steps. We need to explore it and understand what those relationships are in more detail. And of course, this is one country. And so by combining similar assessments, which we've done in other parts of the world, we believe we can actually come to a more quantitative method of looking at some of these issues. I'm not going to go into the details of the methodology because I think we don't have time here today. But the second part of it was really looking at particularly the impacts of plastic leakage on the coastline. And the rationale for that is, as many of you heard, coastal ecosystems are extremely important areas, particularly for seagrasses, mangroves, and they provide a vital, important function, both ecologically and economically to many communities. And so one of the advantages for the methodology we use is that you can break that data down into flows through riverine systems. So you can understand flow that actually comes into the marine environment. And by overlaying some of that to coastal areas, particularly corals and seagrass and mangrove ecosystems. And I should point out, we only looked at those areas adjacent to coastal areas, not going into deeper areas. So putting all of that information together, once again, helps us to understand where we might want to focus attention, because quite often that has to be ultimately looked at from a very practical point of where is that hotspot for action. And what comes out of these kinds of analyses is really you can differentiate areas for intervention when you overlay all of that in relation to either provincial level action or even down to a sub-district level action. And this might be quite relevant if you have limited resources, and particularly in countries in the global south, that is often the case. You have to focus your attention where it is most important. And so this kind of product and tool can be quite useful in combining what we see as the technical part of understanding plastic waste flows and where it ends up in the environment with actually the values to nature. And why is that important? I think most of you have heard of the triple planetary crisis. And really that relates to pollution, climate change, and biodiversity. And so this is one mechanism of actually trying to integrate all of those into one. So in concluding, and I hope I'm sticking to time, there's a long way to go. But I think the point being is that using these kinds of approaches is very relevant, because if you are talking to a policymaker, they don't want to hear the lovely piece of information, oh, it affects my whales or it affects my mangroves. Where do I need to target the attention? How much do I need? Now, we haven't put the economic cost to this yet, but that's the next element, because I think one of the elements when we talk about action is how much does it cost? And where do you get the resources and the funding to do that? Because that is often the biggest challenge to address some of these issues. So really, I think in concluding, we are in the process of we have to fundraise, so we have to actually do this with more ground truthing. The other element we didn't discuss here today is actually the methodologies for quantifying leakage into the environment. And I was very impressed to hear harmonization and data coherence, because those are exactly the same problems we have. We've identified with World Bank 30 different methodologies for assessing plastic flows. Now, all of those don't have the same method. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Janak. Is there any clarificatory question from the audience? Okay.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. Later on, I am going to speak about the wasteful diagram, a methodology to map the leakages, but I was wondering if the methodology that you use is an open methodology.
Yes.
Okay, and where can I find it?
It's on the UNEP IUCN, it's on the UNEP Lifecycle Initiative website.
Perfect.
But to your point, actually, you could do the same analysis with the waste flow diagram data, because we've used the UNEP IUCN data because we had that.
Okay.
But you can apply it to anything. It's not necessarily on the right source.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you very much. A big round of applause for Janak. Janak, you are free to sit there or to come and join because eventually you have to land up there. May I now invite the next speaker, Alexander K. I'm not sure if I pronounce your second name correctly, from Green Delta, Germany. He's going to talk about model-based life cycle sustainability assessment, assessing circular economy solutions for currently underutilized or unused plastic waste, end-of-life electrical vehicle batteries, and bio-based side and waste streams. Quite an impressive topic, Alexander.
Thank you very much. Yes, a long title, but I shortened it in my presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexander Koch. I am a sustainability consultant at Green Delta. I'm based in Berlin. We are also the developers of OpenLSA. And today I will be talking about a sustainability assessment method or model that we've developed in the Treasures project, which is a Horizon Europe project. Just briefly introducing the motivation and background to our topic, then how we applied this new sustainability assessment model by using system dynamics, and then a brief conclusion. So just when we remember the definition, the Brundtland definition for sustainability, we can kind of derive from that sustainability kind of refers to a multidimensional dynamic system that needs to be maintained. And that means not exceeding certain boundaries. And if we also look at the planetary boundary model, we can see that several of these boundaries have been already exceeded. And so the stability of a system might kind of leave its stability and cause basically irreversible changes. So in the end, we can kind of say that sustainability is about the stability of a system that is under pressure, under constant pressure, and exceeding certain boundaries might result in irreversible changes that have a grave impact on our future generations. And we often kind of, when we think about measuring sustainability and setting goals to kind of prevent these irreversible changes, we kind of refer to methods that are available. And kind of then thinking about this multi-dimensional aspect of sustainability, we often refer to this quite simple cited formula. So we say that life cycle sustainability assessment is the combination of life cycle assessment for environmental impacts and life cycle costing for economic impacts and social life cycle assessment for social impacts. But these models, these methods, these formulas kind of don't look at these thresholds that are considered in the planetary boundary model. They do not look at the relationship between these different dimensions of sustainability, and they're very linear. So they're really looking at the individual impacts in that dimension, which kind of in the end will lead to recommendations that are not feasible because you're not considering the external environment, you're not considering the context, and eventually will lead to solutions, recommendations that will fail quite quickly or might not even be replicable in other environments and other contexts. So from this kind of motivation, we are developing a system dynamics model that is supposed to kind of consider all the dimensions and look at this, the aspect of sustainability or modeling sustainability in a multi-dimensional and system-based approach. And just briefly for you to understand, system dynamics is basically a method that's been around for a very long time. And the idea is basically to model a system as a combination of stocks and flow rates. So these stocks, they change over time basically, and this is influenced by the input and output flow of materials, for example. And basically with system dynamics, you can model any system and basically model or predict or simulate the change of stock over time. And the scope and detail of each model or each study is really based, totally up to the modeler itself. So it's a very flexible method and tool. And this is one of the early models from Forrester, where he basically kind of tried to model the entire world, looking at, for example, population, the stock of population and the stock of pollution, and seeing how this entire world kind of works and how these stocks he kind of put in his model might change over time. And when putting it into software, it kind of simulates a future prediction. For example, we can then see the development of population over time. We can see the development of a food ratio over time. And then we can kind of see how this interacts, what might be the reason for that. And we can model certain scenarios to make maybe better decision making. And when we think of sustainability, this might be the result of our simulation. We would kind of look at different stocks, such as resources, seen at this red line, or products, this green line, or emissions, this blue line. So we can see that, as production increases, we have a decrease in resources. Eventually, when resources run out, we have a total collapse of production. At the same time, during the increase of production, we have an increase stock of emissions. Once production collapses because resources run out, emissions decrease, but eventually increase again when we treat these products in the waste treatment process at the end of life. So we kind of we developed a generic model and then applied it in the project to different key value chains. And this is kind of how our model looks. And it's there's a lot going on here, so I'm not going to go into the details of this model, but it kind of has 8 main sections. So we have the product lifecycle, which is like the core of this model. Then we're looking at the demands of the market aspect. We're looking at social well-being. We're looking at environmental areas of protection. We're looking at technology and the development of technology over time. And then we're kind of also, of course, looking at resources and renewable resources and the stock of these resources and how they change over time. And these elements kind of interact, and you basically simulate the change of these stocks over time, and then kind of can make different scenarios or do different scenarios to kind of support decision making and be able to see which strategy might be best for each of these indicators. And this is basically a model that is fed by data from lifecycle assessment, market and context analysis, material flow analysis, lifecycle costing, and so on. And we're applying it in the Treasures project, which really looks at regional circular economy solutions. And we want to assess the solutions for plastics, value chains, batteries, and biomass So a lot of the three very different value chains, and kind of then support basically decision making when we are looking at our solutions in this project, and basically have a tool that can really support the decision making project when we're really applying it on a regional scale. This is just a solutions of a test case study that we did. We collected data on PET recycling in Fredrikstad in Norway. And so this is basically how we predict it to be without changes, without new technologies. We have a steady decline of primary reduction and a steady increase of recycling of PET. But when we implement the technologies we are aiming to implement in the Treasures project, we see that we have an increase in recycling rate and decline in primary production, and the eventual, again, collapse when resources run out. Same kind of trend we see when we look at emissions and resources. Emissions are soaring at the beginning, resources decline over time. If we implement higher recycling rates for PET, we have this kind of delay of the collapse of resources and basically also a lower rate of emissions. So in the end, these two approaches, so system dynamics and life cycle sustainability assessment, we came up with a model-based life cycle sustainability assessment method. And this is basically, we think, a better approach and a better combination that is able to reflect sustainability when we consider the system aspect. So it's quite promising. And applying it in the Treasures project gives us insight into a lot of different value chains that also makes us consider different contexts and what is actually feasible in different regions, in different environments. So it is quite a strong tool to support decision-making for strategies at all levels, but of course, as in all research projects, it is still meant to be further tested and further explored. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Any clarificatory questions for Alexander? Yes, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, regional data, that's a particularly difficult scale to operate. So how do you overcome that challenge? That's the first question.
Mm-hmm.
And the second is, how automated is it? So how do you pull the data in to your model, given the number of data components, and is it open access?
Yes. So to your first question, this was just a test case study that we've done so far, this PET recycling case study. We've used online public available data, and of course, done a lot of assumptions at the beginning, and making these assumptions, it was necessary because the data was not available. And this model is meant to actually work in a more qualitative manner, where we input certain elements that are derived from maybe science-based assumptions that are kind of linked with a verification validation process, because in the end, this is a big model that will require a lot of data, and you will not be able to find all that data. And yes, that's for the first question. The second question, what was it? The automation, yes. So right now it's basically not, so we input everything manually, but in the future, we're kind of planning to make a template or a layout that where actors or stakeholders from all levels can kind of enter certain amounts of data. This model is already kind of linked, so the formulas are in place, so these formulas are fixed, but we'll try to make it in such a way that there is an online platform where we can input the data, and this basically allows you to simulate. At the same time, this online or this tool can be linked to other software tools, which can then maybe even automate the whole calculation. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Alexander. Invite you to take the hot seat. Yeah, I understand there's a question. Maybe we can keep it for the discussion time. May I now invite Alejandra Gemes from Colombia to make her presentation on implementation strategy and results of Santa Maria pilot project for local prevention of marine litter. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And for joining the conversation, of course, for our online public. So today we are going to present the implementation strategy and results of Santa Marta. That is a marine prevention project. It's called PROMAR, Prevention of Marine Litter in the Caribbean Sea. Okay, so where is the thing? This thing. Okay. Okay, so PROMAR is a project that has been going on for around 2 years now, 2.5 years. Is implemented by CEGESTI in Costa Rica, partly in the Dominican Republic, ABRELPI in Brazil, and our guidance is Adelphi in Berlin. Today is joining us Richard Berner from Adelphi, so any questions you can also ask him. Okay, so what is the main objective of PROMAR? Is to reduce the flows of plastic waste, mainly plastic packages and single-use plastics, which we all know that are the main problem of marine litter. Marine litter is composed mainly of plastic, of single-use plastics, around 60%, between 60% and 70% are single-use plastics. And we formulated circular economies. Once we understood the problem in those countries, we formulated a circular economy project for each one of those countries. Okay, so really quickly, we are framed within 4 work packages. The first work package is understanding the problem. So we applied 2 methodologies. The first methodology is the one that I was talking about earlier, a wasteful diagram developed by the GIZ. And the second methodology is a sampling guide developed by ABRELPI in Brazil. So we applied that methodology to each one of the countries. The second work package is, now that we understood the problem, what are we going to do with that problem? So we formulated the circular economy project. And my presentation today is going to explain the highlights of that circular economy project in Santa Marta, Colombia. Okay, the third package is EPR. In Colombia, we have an EPR scheme since 2018, but in the other countries, in the Dominican Republic and in Costa Rica, they don't have an EPR system. And we all know that for circular economy, EPR is a vital tool. And the final package is raising awareness among the stakeholders. It is really important to engage all types of public, the private sector, the public sector, the foundations, and of course, the public in general, the consumers in this case. Okay, so now let's go to work package 2. But first, let's understand the problem for the Caribbean region. The Caribbean region is composed by 37 geopolitical entities, from which 28 are islands. As you can imagine, the problem regarding the waste management in the islands is very difficult because of the transport and the infrastructure regarding waste management, the recycling capacity, and so on. It is really hard to manage the waste in those islands. So let's see some ciphers from UNEP. This is data that we took from UNEP 2020. The CR, the Caribbean region, is generating 48 million tons of solid waste, and from those, 1.3 million tons of plastic are entering the coastal waters yearly. Because of what? Of what I just told you: limited recycling capacity, education of the consumers, and other priorities among the population. I mean, these are very vulnerable people, and first they need to eat, they need to give clothes to their kids, and so on. So the waste management problem is really not in the top of their priorities. And well, you can find many reasons why the waste management is a problem, but here you can see the main ones. That is for the coastal, for the Caribbean region, right? But now let's go to Colombia, to Santa Marta. Maybe some of you have heard about Colombia or have visited Colombia, okay? So Santa Marta is a city located in the coastal area. Here are some data that you can find. We have 6 recycling companies. It is not the same to talk about recycling companies and waste storage facilities. A waste storage facility only trades the material. It's only about selling and buying. But a recycling company employs these recyclers. Transformers, that means end of the cycle, closing the cycle. We have 5 transformation companies and this number of households and this population located in the area of influence of our pilot project. Okay, so here is the methodology that I was talking about. The wasteful diagram is just to understand the problem, to see the leakages that are going into the environment. I am not going to talk about the methodology itself because I don't have the time, but this is all official data. We took the data from the public entities. The methodology talks about a period of five years where you can take the data. And finally, we have these leakages that are around 413 tons per year that are ending up in the rivers. And of course, all the rivers of Santa Marta go into the Caribbean Sea. So everything is going to the Caribbean Sea. This methodology was developed by GIZ and the other entities that you can see right there on the presentation. Okay, so finally, what did we do to attack the problem, or what are we doing to attack the problem? Okay, so first of all, we developed a financial model for the recycling companies. This means giving the information to them. How much do you have to collect each day? How many recyclers do you have to employ to do that? How many vehicles? And with those data, you can say to them, look, this is the quantity of material that you have to collect in order to be financially sustainable. Later on, we clear the value chain of the materials. That means eliminating intermediaries because they have a lot of people in between the chain. So every one of them takes money from them. So we connected the recycler organization with the transformation companies, and that increases the prices for the material. A methodology guide for social intervention. As I said, these are very vulnerable people. They really need help in terms of understanding the importance of the labor that they are developing. Sorry, I am running out of time, but you can see there the pillars of our circular economy pilot, and of course I will be here during the 3 days, so you can just ask me. Okay, so just finally saying the most successful thing that we accomplished was to manage the waste management scheme with the EPR. As I told you, circular economy doesn't work without an EPR system. It just doesn't work. Okay, so here are some data that we achieved. We managed to impact 70% of the households throughout the EPR scheme. I ran out of time. My name is Alejandra Gámez. I am here with Richard Berner from Adelphi. So please feel free to contact me. We will be here all week. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any clarificatory questions? Okay, so we'll move to the last presentation. May I now invite Alexandra Harrington to make her presentation on just transition under the Plastics Treaty agenda. Over to you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I've realized that there are 3 out of 4 panel members with the same name of some form, Alexandra. So it could be very confusing during question and answer time. So we'll just get that out of the way right now. And I also would like to point out that I am the only one who's not presenting data. So I either apologize or am happy to end the session in that way. But as Janica mentioned, I am also part of IUCN, in this case, the Royal Commission on Environmental Law. And lawyers, as we all know, are generally not good with data, which is why we need scientists and experts to tell us what to do and how to do it best. But the topic today is on just transition. And I think especially from the past comments that we've heard, the importance of having scientific data and knowledge. I'm hoping the reason that you're now listening to me is, what do we do with this? In part, it's to take it into the Plastics Treaty. And so the Plastics Treaty, as Janica mentioned in the beginning, is something we are now working on. It is on a very tight timetable. Yeah, we started last November 2022. We have been asked to be very ambitious as those involved in the process. So countries and also NGOs and IGOs like IUCN to deliver a treaty by the end of 2024. This is quite unheard of. And those of you who are familiar with the BBNJ negotiations will know that's taken a great deal of time, longer than 2 years. So we'll see. But the authorization came from the UN Environment Assembly. And the idea is that this will be a plastic treaty on all forms of plastic in the marine environment as well as on land. So the entire life cycle of plastics. So everything that you're working on, that you've been talking to us about, including polymers, including raw materials that go into plastics, will all be important for this. And despite my lawyerly heart, we will need lots of data and background that I will need you all to explain so that we can make it actually work. This is the general subtext of my discussion. This is marine, but it is also terrestrial. This is a very important point. I think we can't really stress that enough. And all countries are welcome. Most have decided to join these negotiations. They are also very much open negotiations for viewpoints outside of countries. So NGOs and IGOs have been part of the process from the beginning. The schedule, and I will get to the just transition element momentarily, but just to give you an idea of how this is going to be taking place. 2 meetings have already taken place. One, as I mentioned, in November of 2022, one in Paris in May. We will be meeting in Nairobi in November, and then next year in Canada. If you're jealous, it's Ottawa in April, so we might get snow. I don't know, so don't be too jealous of that if you do love Canada. And then also in South Korea in, we believe, November of next year, where we might have a final draft. But one of the issues that has come up in the discussion is the idea of just transition, and including just transition as an element of the Plastics Treaty for all affected communities and all affected members of the life cycle of plastics production, consumption, and ultimately recycling and use or waste management and capacity. As a reminder for those who are not that familiar, the idea of just transition is something that very much came to life, depending on who you talk to, either from the European Union or from the US context, coming out of coal and phasing out of coal and phasing out of fossil fuels. Many of you may be familiar with it in the context of fossil fuel phasing out in the present moment, especially under the Paris Agreement, especially under the idea of moving into the renewable energy sector. But it is actually something that has become much bigger. It's much more complex and can be included in many other areas, as well as in the fossil fuel industry, where it is so very much necessary. In the Plastics Treaty to date, we have seen a very interesting progress from just transitions being something that was not mentioned in the UNEA resolution authorizing the discussions, was not really mentioned in the initial preparatory work leading up to, and policy papers leading up to the first meeting, and then very quickly came onto the scene during the first meeting. And by the second meeting in Paris was something that was actively discussed. It continues to be actively discussed at present, and we know it certainly will be as we get into the negotiations in Nairobi. And what is important here is to think about all the lessons we have learned, where various types of plastics and other types of raw materials come in, how they're used how they're produced. And the industries that create them, the industries that use them in products, the industries that then are involved in waste management in those sectors, in the plastics treaty context of just transition, because these are industries that will be impacted. If we have a plastics treaty, which we all hope we will, well, those of us involved certainly do, it will be impactful nationally, sub-regionally, internationally, and it will have a number of impacts on these industries and on the people who are working in these industries. To date, we have heard discussions about just transitions for waste pickers, just transitions for the informal sector, because these are vulnerable and marginalized communities typically that are left out of most of these discussions, are certainly left out of many legal discussions and legal protections, especially those in the informal sector. However, what we also need to do when we think about just transitions in the treaty context here is think about the fact that we will have engineers and chemists, we will have those involved in producing products with plastics, and those involved in using products with plastics, medical professionals, et cetera, who will have to transition in the products that they use, who will have to have effective means of substitutions that are also not harmful to the environment or to themselves as part of this transition. And obviously those who work in waste management will be very heavily affected. And also when we think about this, we need to think about how we take lessons from other sectors in the just transition, how we learn, for example, from sectors in the coal and extractive processes where we see a decrease in jobs, also then resulting in knock-on effects such as increases in community poverty, increases in domestic violence, increases in educational opportunity loss and job opportunity loss in a greater familial context rather than only in the one worker. So I know my time is running short and I am sure we all would like a coffee at some point. So just to point out that this is something that is really quite an emerging topic within the Plastics Treaty. It's something that we don't usually talk about in a scientific forum per se, because it is often labeled a labor concept and a labor discussion. But what is really critical is that we merge science and law and policy in this way, so that it's certainly for plastics and then potentially for other treaty regimes that may come into effect into the future relating to raw materials, mining and minerals, et cetera. We have a roadmap for how we can include these issues and these considerations together in one meaningful legal text that has international and national and subnational components and elements. So thank you very much. I will turn the mic back to you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Invite you also to the hot seat. Okay, so questions, please. There was a question. Yeah, please.
So to Alexander, first of all, thank you for creating OpenLCA, first of all. Secondly, it's horrible because of the user friendliness. And if you want to increase the data quality and entry into the OpenLCA databases for simple people like you have to improve the user interface. That's a first request. Please do that. And then you will have a ton of new data you require. So that's the first thing. Second thing is how you approach the life cycle assessment for biomass. For example, if we have in the energy transition sector, coal transitioning to sludge and all of that stuff. So how will you approach this?
So
We
to
can
your,
maybe have the next slide for the voting on the presentations.
to your first comment, yes, could be that OpenLCA is not most user-friendly for most people. It is a very powerful but an open source tool, which also allows you to do LCAs with data very quickly. We have several manuals that you can also kind of use, and using these manuals, once you've understood this software, it's an extremely powerful tool. That is my comment to the first comment. And to the second question, so this new system dynamics approach of doing sustainability assessments, of course, we have to consider multiple material streams or material flows, and basically kind of also model the stocks and the change of these stocks for each material flow. And eventually when certain material gets replaced by one material flow, that you have these kind of time steps during the simulation where you say, okay, at this point in time, the market might shift, might change and replace that material flow, and eventually then decrease one stock of one material flow and increase the next. And then in that way, we can really, with this multi-dimensional aspects on material streams, also consider different materials replacing other raw materials, if that answers your question.
It's a very scientific answer. Thank you very much. But I have still one question for the Ms. Harrington, if I may. So there is product lifecycle assessment. There is a corporate emission accounting, and I think plastic treaty relates to both. If you talk about social impact and environmental and business impact, so how are you going to align this with the tons of regulations already existing in European Union, in UK, and also in United States, and coming up in Japan and all over the world?
That is why I help in providing ideas for drafting the treaty, and then I let everyone else do it. But no, in reality, the treaty regime itself will be something that is obviously state-driven, and states will join on. But then it is at home their responsibility to implement. What will be critical here is how we frame, and certainly IUCN and others have suggested this be done very strongly, how we frame the compliance mechanism, how we frame oversight, reporting, national action plans, national implementation plans. We actually have a paper out that is a joint IUCN CIEL, which is Center for International Environmental Law paper, on how we might be able to do a national action plan and national implementation plan system under the treaty, and then what type of oversight that might require. And we are actually having an event on that. It's an online event on Wednesday. So if you're interested, see me afterwards. I can get your email and send it to you.
The auditing aspect is what we're struggling a lot with at the moment. So
Absolutely.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And this is where we really need to think about the pitfalls and design around the pitfalls of what we've seen be done in the past at the EU level, especially, but also at the international MEA level, so that we can figure out where we have problems and challenges and then fix those gaps, so we can have an evolving process and not just kind of replicate the issues that have already happened. Thank you.
Just a quick reminder to vote for the presentations. The link is there also available in the application. Do we have any questions from the remote audience? No questions, so we.
I have a question. Well, for one of you. Recently, I saw a Netflix documentary, and they were commenting about the fishing industry, and the plastic pollution related to it. And they mentioned that like 50% of the microplastic come from the fishing industry. And I didn't see anything mentioned about that. And normally I don't see this kind of information when we talk about plastic. Can you comment on that? And is it misinformation, or what's your opinion? So.
Yeah, I think the issue of microplastics is really growing quite rapidly. It's one also where there is still a lot of debate about quantification of it, but we're progressing well. The main source of microplastics in particular is the degradation of plastic material into smaller particles that enter into the ocean marine environment and then get absorbed by organic material, by organisms, that then gets into the fishing, into the sectors. So that the challenge is actually the quantification of that in a really substantive way, but there's clearly evidence that it's growing. We didn't talk about it, but that's an important part of the biodiversity point of view. Specifically, a lot of that focus also has been, particularly for the fishing industry, there's a whole area of work on abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear and the impacts of ghost fishing, for example. So there are a number of different elements, but the microplastics issue is certainly one that actually it'll be a question that comes up in the treaty, whether it should be part of it or we just talk about macroplastics. And now there's a new term called nanoplastics. So we're going down the change, but as we get down to those final levels, actually managing it is the challenge, not so much as understanding the issue. But I'll let my colleague comment.
Thank you. No, just to compliment you, the source of microplastics are several, definitely the one that you mentioned. Another source is tourism, definitely in the city where we did the study. That is the main source of microplastics and also mesoplastics, right? The big ones that you can find, that you can see. Another possible source could be the disasters, like a hurricane and things like that, because that takes material into our beaches and of course into our water sources and so on and so on. But there is not, I don't know, like a study that really put data into the sources of microplastic and how much is it on disasters, how much is it on tourism, how much is it on the fishing industry. I don't know an study. So, but those are the main sources of marine litter.
Okay, we still have time for more questions. Yes, please.
Not so much a question, but just a response to that question. So my colleague, Tamara Galloway, who you may know, she's probably the world authority on micro and nanoplastics and ecotoxicology. So the question about its impact on sea life and human health, she's probably the best resource that you can go to. So that's Professor Tamara Galloway, Exeter University. So, and I think as someone rightly pointed out, it's not necessarily the plastic, the polymer per se, but it's the additives, and it's the weathering and the release and the degradation of the material and all its components and catalysts that are actually the source of the problem, so the health problem. But the jury's still out on the exact nature and quantification of how serious in what quantity.
Thank you for the information, and that qualifies you to join the hot seat participants.
I want to comment on that, because just my idea was like, if there is any initiative to mitigate this kind of problem in the fishing industry, because we always heard about the consumers, like change the plastics. I don't know, this trawl should be not plastic. And then someone throw you information that 50% of the microplastic come from the industry. And what does happen to mitigate this part? So it was more in this sense that I was curious.
Yeah, maybe I can comment on that. I mean, at least in my country, there are a lot of regulations. We are specialists in copying regulations, right? But in reality, it's very different. I am talking about Colombia, but I guess I will dare to talk about the entire Latin American region, right? There are a lot of regulations in terms of managing the waste that comes from the fishing industry. But when you are away for 2 or 3 months, who is going to really go and see how are you managing the waste? I mean, it is super difficult to have the entities really controlling that type of waste. So in paper, there are a lot of regulations, but in reality, we have a low institutional capacity.
Okay. Is there any input from the Just Treaty part on the fishing industries?
Thank you. Did you want to jump in first? Or, so I think that is certainly one of the industries that we have to think about. And this is why we have to, this is a very bad pun, but cast a wide net in terms of thinking about some of you got that, thank you if you did, in terms of casting our thoughts to how far along does this work and how far along does plastics impact in the use cycle. And so that's why we need a treaty that is quite broad in that respect and will be regulatory in multiple sectors, not only in the way that we initially think of production and then some type of consumption, straws, et cetera, the very visible things, but really getting into the much more detailed understanding of how plastics are used and then how we regulate that. And also I know, and Janica is probably better placed to speak about this than I am because he's was speaking on this in Paris, but the World Bank is organizing a significant effort to address this as a group. So as a group of international organizations, IGOs, NGOs, et cetera, coming together to look at I can never get the acronym right, but abandoned and lost and ghost gear in the fishing context. So there are some efforts that are really being started up. But interestingly, that type of activism is actually coming in a great deal to push these boundaries and to push Netflix documentaries, exposés, et cetera, are actually being quite critical in that concept. So it's another way to get the message out in that regard.
Would you like to add something?
Just
Sunil?
one little thing. Also, it relates to a number of other existing agreements. For example, the port states measures that controls waste in ports, which is managed by the International Maritime Organization. So some of these rules and regulations may already exist within existing multilateral structures. And so the question is also to make it compatible with those FAO, for example, and the International Maritime Organization would be two major agencies that have rules and regulations that overlay on some of this. And then one final point is with regards to microplastics in particular, ultimately all of the source of it is land-based, right? So it degrades in the ocean. And so the solution is actually prevention and mitigation at the point of source, not to address it once it's in the system, because quite frankly, we don't have enough money to address the situation in the marine environment. It's a never-ending story.
Thank you, Janil. Is there any other pressing question? Okay, so I have my last question, my pound of flesh. Okay, if you distance yourself, and everyone can comment for a minute, maybe. If you distance yourself from the methodologies and all the details and technicalities you've been expressing, what is the viewpoint on the single-use plastics ban? Because this ban is working in some places, largely not working in many places. So how do you think your methodology or your way of thinking would help to make that policy better, better implementable? Because implementation is a huge issue out there. So do we start with you, Janik? Quickly.
It's a simple answer, actually. It's enforcement. The challenge is not the regulation, it's the enforcement of the regulation and also allowing the proper transition. So in countries like, say, Antigua and Barbuda and Grenada as examples, they actually had a whole transition process where they didn't just go overnight and put the ban in. They actually had a method to actually get people on board, find alternatives before it actually got into place. Whereas in a country like Kenya, the first time they did it, boom, they put it, it was a total failure. They had to redo the whole process. So really, it's about thinking on how you actually implement some of these rules and regulations and the follow-up enforcement.
What would be the role of supporting legislation on banning production rather than banning consumption? Because you will never be able to ban consumption if there is production. There will always be marketing and sales people who will sell what is produced.
That is the hot topic for the treaty negotiations, is where we control it. Do those producers, particularly the oil industry and oil producing nations, virgin plastics is the challenge is virgin plastics is still cheaper than recycling, right? So until the economics just don't make sense just yet. And that's the challenge. And one of the big issues we've been talking about is that so far only 10% or less than 10% of plastic is recycled. And that's because there is no market for it. That's the main driver.
Alexander, any comment from your methodology perspective?
Yes, just to say that, of course, it is always important to kind of consider the context in which you're implementing such a ban. And that's kind of course, also the idea behind the tool we're developing is to kind of be able to include the context, the market, how will the market react to such a ban, how will other material streams develop because of such a ban, will this eventually really lead to the target we've set, and this is kind of always or often missing when you're doing sustainability assessments, when you're using tools that are supporting such policy decision making that might not consider the visibility, the context, and so on. So that is like one of the main motivations. Yes.
Alexandra?
Okay, so Santa Marta in Colombia was the first city in Colombia to ban the use of single-use plastics. It hasn't worked out at all because there is not another material that can replace in terms of price and uses the plastic. So it is like a network of plastics under the radar because there are no option right now. So unless you really apply the concept of circular economy, it is not going to work out. You have to investigate other types of material that can fulfill the use of the plastic right now. You have to think about eco-design. You have to give incentives to the population and to educate them. So you have to really apply all the tools that the circular economy is giving, otherwise it is just not going to work.
Many people say that it is not a question of alternatives because we were doing something when plastics were not there. This is quite a recent phenomenon, a couple of decades. We were living life before that also. So, debatable point. Okay.
Absolutely. So I think to touch on Janica's point, something that we have been spending a great deal of time speaking of is the connection with trade, and making sure that, yes, it's wonderful to have a bag ban. Everyone feels like they're doing something good, et cetera, et cetera. But making sure it's enforceable, and then also making sure that the trade regulations are in place to appropriately do things like address subsidies, either subsidies that make bags much cheaper and make virgin plastics much cheaper, or that can be designed to conform with WTO rules and yet still allow for beneficial pricing for recycled products, et cetera. And obviously we're not there yet, but this is one of the discussions in the treaty context. And I think it also is really important to think about whether the low-hanging fruit of saying we're going to ban something is actually as important as saying we're not going to ban something yet. We're going to think about the alternatives. We're also going to think about the systemic issue, because it's very easy to ban something that is relatively, minor from a legal perspective. But if it doesn't work, not only do you create an informal sector or an underground economy, but it also then calls into question the entire effort to address plastics. And it's a question that I get a lot. It hasn't worked in my community. It hasn't worked with straws or bags, et cetera. Why do we think a treaty will work? So that's often a background thought to have.
Okay, thank you. So if there are no more questions, we can, there is one.
Hello.
Last question.
Sorry. So I'm Adèle Laurin. I'm an analytical chemist, and I have a question for the three Alexanders. Regarding the recycle, how do we address the recycling of plastic? When we address the recycling of plastic, do we take into account the possibilities of leachables and like everything that will leak from the plastic, the recycled plastic, towards the formulas?
So yes, of course, we have in the model, we always have to consider litter because litter will always occur, and there's always, a certain degree of plastic that is not going 100% into the loop. And in our model, we really define these different output streams, end of life streams. So you have the recycling rate, you have the disposal rate, and the littering rate. And obviously, we need to consider litter and how this also impacts, has an impact on the different indicators, and how we can basically reduce that rate.
Okay, early bird gets the worm. You just have half a minute now.
Yeah, okay, so really quickly, I am not a chemical engineer, right? So I am not an expert in recycling technologies, but right now we have both mechanical and chemical recycling. Mechanical recycling is really simple. You just take a machine and that's it. You break the material into smaller pieces, and so you can incorporate those pieces into a chemical recycling process. But I dare to say that we are lacking a lot of investigation regarding chemical recycling technologies, and we really need to put an effort into that subject. Right now, we need to break those, how do you say that in English? Cadenas poliméricas, polymers chains, right? Because that is the base of the chemical recycling process. That will be my point of view.
And I have no technical knowledge, so I'm happy to defer to you. Except we are looking at multiple ways of regulating and figuring out how to put those in annexes and other things to keep them updated.
Okay, thank you very much. We've earned our cup of coffee. And if anybody has not voted, thank you. If anyone has not voted, please remember to vote for the presentation. Thank you.